Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Pet Behaviour Chat. This is episode 54. And I've got Nora here with me, so you guys know that it's going to be a kitty cat episode. So we're going to talk about cats today. And we've got a topic today that I guess can be seen as being a little bit controversial, and we'll explain a little bit more why. But it's a topic that I think is very close to both of our hearts because we do deal with this quite a lot, especially here in the UAE. And obviously myself seeing behavior cases and Nora seeing many of those cases with me are actually faced with sort of this topic quite a lot. And the topic is all around street cats or stray cats or, originally feral cats that perhaps have moved closer to sort of living in a human environment, and whether we should take these cats off the street and put them into our homes. What that means for some of the cats, and obviously, there are always going to be exceptions to every rule. But in general, what are the things that we need to consider when we think about taking a cat off the street and putting them into our home? What that might mean for their welfare, for their quality of life, for their behavioral needs, and why then Nora and I end up seeing so many of these cats, or quite a few of these cats, as behavior problem cases, because obviously there is a correlation there between why we then end up seeing them and how they came to be in a home. So yeah, as I say, it can be a bit of a controversial topic, especially because we've got so many rescue groups here in the UAE that are very, very passionate about getting these cats off the street. And you can absolutely understand where they're coming from, because the streets can be a pretty harsh environment, especially in the very hot summer months. Some of these cats have diseases, they're not well, or they have injuries. And that's perhaps the initial motivation for helping them, for taking them to receive veterinary care. And then a lot of the times, once that's happened, people find it very difficult to place them back on the street. And that's then when a lot of these cats end up in homes, sometimes in multi-cat homes, and where we potentially can see problems in some cases. So that's a bit of an overview. We're going to try and give our perspective of it. But I just want to be really clear at the beginning of this topic that we obviously regard every single case as an individual case. And for some cats, they absolutely love being domestic cats, then, being pet cats. But we've also seen that be a real problem for some other cats. So yeah, that's what we're going to chat about today. So welcome, Nora. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
And I know this is a topic that you feel really passionately about. And I wonder whether you can maybe just give us a bit of an intro on your perspective of things, and maybe what you've seen also in the sort of last 10 years that we've been working together, because we've been seeing these cats for literally the last 10 years, not on a daily basis, but certainly quite frequently. So yeah, I would love to hear your initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. I had a great teacher on this matter, which is actually my own cat, Freddie, and he taught me so much about what cats need and treating cats as individual based on their own background. But it's taken me about 10 years to actually realize these things. I think we see here in Abu Dhabi so many cats in the rehoming system. There's quite an overwhelmed system here of foster homes and rehoming, and the vast majority of cats we see in that system are Arabian Maus, many if not all of whom started their life on the street. So Freddie, my own cat, actually came to me here at GBC, and he was probably about 4 or 5 months old at the time. And I remember clearly when he was in the clinic, he was here to be rehomed, and he was petrified of everybody and everything. And there was a huge effort made to, help him become a little bit more friendly or a little bit more rehomable. And I realized very quickly how stressed he was in the clinic, even though we did everything we could for him, and I took him home. And I realized over the years that what Freddie needed was space and choice. And only when he got those things was he his true self or his best self. And I found over the years that I kept moving to bigger and bigger properties, mostly for him. And he was, when he was confined in an apartment where I could keep him, in my mind, safe, he was very stressed, and he would vocalize a lot. He'd be very scared of anybody coming into the house. And as soon as I moved to a property that was a villa with outside space and he had free access, he was like a different cat. He was so happy. He was able to act out all of his natural tendencies, which I realized despite my efforts before, he really wasn't able to in the full capacity. So it was very interesting watching his journey, and the happier he got as his environment changed. And yeah, we see examples of this all the time, with cases here in the hospital and also in behavior cases, cats who were rehomed from the street and often can have behavioral issues, maybe not always getting to the point where they come and see you, but just anecdotally that we hear in clinic or that we see in clinic when we're trying to treat them. I think that it's definitely something that's very close to our hearts and something that really us and the rescuers and everybody who owns an Arabian Mau actually want the best for these cats. But it can be a little bit sticky, a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, agreeing on what that is, for Arabian Maus or for street cat Arabian Maus. And that sometimes long-term homing or foster care is not ideal for them. But then, it comes with our own emotions. And too, of course, we form great attachments. And when I think back to my early days with Freddie, there's a big part of me that thinks he should have been left to live his life as he would have chosen on the streets potentially. But of course, I was so in love with him. So it can become a very emotive subject, for anybody who's had an Arabian Mau.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think we should probably just kind of fill anybody who's listening that's not based in the UAE on a little bit about what Arabian Mau cats are, because we keep talking about these Arabian Mau cats. And I guess the way I would describe an Arabian Mau is a very sort of oriental looking cat. They're usually quite large in body size. They're extremely athletic. They're very vocal. So again, very much those oriental tendencies. They are kind of native to this area. I think the Arabian Mau as a breed was actually sort of coined as a breed. I'm thinking probably about 10 years ago now that they were recognized as a breed. But yeah, imagine sort of almost a Siamese looking cat, but slightly bigger and more athletic, and with sort of your typical almost moggy coloring. So we'll see lots of tabby cats, lots of ginger tabbies. We'll see lots of tortoiseshells. We'll see lots of black and whites, pure blacks. So, and very short haired. So kind of very, I guess, acclimatized to the hot climate here in the UAE. But when I think, so I actually have an Arabian Mau cat myself, our little squidge, and she's not too dissimilar to Nora's Freddie, apart from that she actually did, I guess, find home living a much safer place than being out on the street. So I myself am actually, somebody who has an Arabian Mau cat and that recognizes that, yes, living in a home but with a lot of freedom was maybe not the worst thing for her. But then they're not all the same. That's, I think, why it's so important to look at these cats individually. Plus, she is afforded a lot of freedom. We have a lot of space. She has an indoor-outdoor lifestyle. She can come back home for her safe base, her food, but she spends a lot of her time outside doing what cats naturally do. But that's a little bit sort of to paint the picture. And I guess here in the UAE, on the one end of the spectrum, we have these Arabian Mau cats that are just as I described them. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we'll have a lot of the sort of, I guess, designer cats that are sold through pet shops that are either Persians or long-haired cats or, Turkish Angoras or ragdolls or Scottish folds. So we've got kind of both ends of the spectrum here in the UAE. And oftentimes I think people find it difficult to understand the different needs, even of the different breeds of cats that we have. So I guess that's a little bit of an overview of what an Arabian Mau is. Have you got anything to add to that, Nora? Because I know you know them very, very well.
I think they're the ultimate athletes too. They're, just so extremely physical. Yeah, and I think that they, even more so than the typical cat, maybe really need that element of choice in their life, that they are absolutely masters of their own destiny. And like you said, with Squidge at home, you're able to provide her constant choice, and that's really lovely.
Yeah, I think choice and control are important to any cat. However, it feels like they're even more important to these Arabian Mau cats. And I think some of that might be to do with, if not their genetics, then certainly their epigenetics. Epigenetics are, I guess, behavioral traits that develop very early on in life and have a lot to do with whether genes are expressed or not expressed. And that can come down a lot to the environment that they're born into, nutritional or quality of nutrition when they're babies, their mother's mental and emotional and behavioral health when they're pregnant with the kittens, and what their stress response system is actually primed to do when they're born. So we see a lot of Arabian Mau cats that are born on the streets are born with their nervous system ready for a life on the streets. So they will be a lot more sensitive to stress. They will be a lot more averse to risk. They will perhaps have a much stronger fight-flight response. They'll be less trusting of people. That can also be to do with what they learn in their early socialization period. But all those things, I think, together make the Arabian Mau cat quite different from a neurobiochemical point of view and from a maybe genetic, but certainly epigenetic point of view, and makes them quite different to a lot of the cats that we perhaps, back in Europe, or certainly, if we think about sort of the designer breed cats that are bred into homes and are bred much more for home living than our Arabian Mau. So I think, yeah, they are a slightly different cat, I would say.
Yeah,
What are your
definitely.
thoughts?
Definitely. And I do think it's super important to consider them, each as individual as well within that, because what you were discussing about the epigenetics, that's something that we can't know 99% of the time when we want to adopt a cat or a kitten. We just can't know. And I think it's really, really important, especially for veterinary professionals and for rescuers, is that they are considering all cats as individuals, and they are considering their temperament, their stress levels, how are they in confinement, before they look to rehome them. I think it's really important that there's some sort of assessment, either by you, the person who wants to adopt, or by the professionals who are actually helping that process, that you really need an element of training to be able to recognize if this individual cat is going to be happy with a life of confinement, or if they're going to be much more happy returning to the streets.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And it's actually really interesting because we've sort of noticed over the years that there are a couple of different ways that street cats find themselves in a home. One I touched on earlier is that whole idea of that they're perhaps sick or they're injured, and people see that and they can't, walk away from that, which I think is wonderful. They pick those cats up, they take them to a veterinary clinic to get care. And then, once that has happened, they find it very difficult to put them out on the streets again. So that's one scenario. But the other scenario, and Nora, I'd love for you to talk about this because the way you explain it is so lovely, are these cats that are street cats that are just very, very friendly to people. And because of their friendliness, people assume that they need to live in a home. So, and that's how then they find themselves in a home. And then when they get in that home, there may be, their temperament changes. Do you want to touch a little bit on that? Because I think you've got such a lovely way of talking about that.
Sure. We, over the years, have had a number of clients who are tourists and will come here, and they're out for dinner somewhere, and a little kitty cat is coming over, and they're so friendly to them, and they form a bond, and they immediately want to take this cat into their home and live with them. And the way I would normally describe it is that is situational friendliness, that we can perceive their friendliness in that moment as them saying, I want to come live with you. I love you so much. We've just met and you're lovely, and I want to give up this life on the streets and be with you. But we forget that the reason often the cat is so happy in that moment is because they're free, they're in their territory, they're having all of their needs met. It's going to be a challenge taking any cat who's in that sort of state where they do genuinely have all of their needs met into a home and to be able to replicate that. And a lot of people then do find that friendliness that they originally had might not be there, or it might be, you know, there's elements of frustration when they get them into the home, or, you know, destructive behaviors later on. But really, I think that we can often perceive a friendly street cat outside as being, they're so friendly, they must come into my home and be friendly too. And really that's not necessarily the case. Cats are often very friendly where you find them because that's where they are happiest.
Yeah. And that's such a great way of looking at it, is that's exactly the reason that they're so happy, is because they have all that freedom, that choice, that control, and they're having all their behavioral needs met. And I think, you know, looking at it through a human lens, you know, we might think, God, how is that possible that this cat can be so happy in an environment that feels to us as humans unsafe? You know, there's no consistency of food, there's no sort of shelter, you know, there's potentially no kind of human love, all those sorts of things. But actually what we really need to do is look at what the needs of the cat are, which are obviously very, very different if you look at it through a cat's lens than if you look at it through a human's lens, and how we perceive the world differently to the cats. So yeah, that's a really great point.
Mm-hmm. So I think that it's really, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think it's really important to remember that, like, you know, what you mentioned earlier, that lots of cats come into our lives because they've been seen sick or injured, and they are brought to a vet clinic and then they're rehomed, is that it is really wonderful to be able to help and treat cats that you see like that. It's a very selfless, very caring thing to do. But really no animal and no cat should ever be worse off after our interventions. So for me, if we're looking at both their physical and their emotional, mental health and well-being, treating the cat, dealing with the injury, sickness, however that is, ideally in as short and stress-free a time as possible, is a wonderful thing to do. But if it's going to, you know, result in a life of something they wouldn't choose, or something that they are just not bred for, they're just not ready for, then we do often end up leaving the cats in a worse position than if you make those choices. So I think it's what you mentioned about putting, you know, human emotions in that is very true, because we feel we've rescued them, we've fixed them. Now it's our duty to take care of them forever. When in many cases, the kindest thing to do would be to treat them, help them, and re-release them. But that can hurt as a human, mm-hmm. loving something, caring for them, paying for them, and then letting mm-hmm. them go. I think that's sometimes not compatible with what we think we should do in those cases. You know, you help someone, it's like you're making a commitment and you want to see that through. And it can be hard to reframe that a little bit, that, you know, that might not be the best thing for that cat.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. And I think, you know, some cats, I think it's much easier to make those decisions on, right? Some cats absolutely adapt perfectly to home living, to indoor living, and they do make great pet cats. Especially, I think we see in the cases where we do have that option for indoor outdoor living for those cats that have previously been on the street. So they've now got a safe base. They can come and go, but they still get that kind of care, medical attention, you know, good food, good quality food, you know, all those things. So that's the one end of the spectrum. And then we also can see those cats that are, you know, essentially unhandleable. Those are the cats that will often come into us as TNR cats. And it's very clear for everybody, including the rescuers, to see that this is not a cat that's suitable for home living, because they find even the confinement around that TNR process so challenging that everybody knows the best thing for that particular cat is to release it. I think it's those cats that fall in the middle somewhere, those cats that are in those gray areas, that either end up in a situation where they've perhaps gone from street living now to a high-rise apartment, which is maybe a one-bedroom apartment or a studio apartment, where that choice and that control is taken away from them. So that would be kind of the one scenario. Or a cat that's put into a multi-cat environment where they don't have the opportunity to move away from the other cats. They can't disperse away from them as they naturally would if they were living on the streets. Or just those cats that, you know, the ones that we spoke about earlier that were friendly when they were on the street, but their temperament, their personality, their behavior completely changes as a result of that confinement. So I think it's those cats that fall into those gray areas that are, in my view, most at risk, and that most at risk from I guess, a poor welfare outcome or a poor quality of life outcome. And it's like you mentioned earlier, Nora, it's that individual assessment of where on that spectrum each individual cat falls, and whether they're 100% need to be released back out onto the street, 100% can stay in a home, or somewhere in the middle, which is the sort of the difficult thing to do, is to make those assessments.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we have to consider the individual prospective owners as well as the individual cat, the individual homes. It's quite a lot different having an in-betweener cat who maybe enjoys human company but is used to free living. A home on a farm with a cat flap looks very different to a home in a high-rise apartment with 5 other cats. We really do have to assess that, and for the prospective owners too, they have to, I think, be realistic about what they're able to provide, and to be able to provide that choice as much as possible for cats that fall in this gray area.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So I guess one of the reasons that we decided to do this episode today is because we did actually recently have a case where, I think this was something that we were seeing. It was a cat that was taken from the street, essentially, from an area that they were living in, due to extremely well-meaning reasons, and brought into a home with, I think, 6 already existing cats, if I'm not wrong, 6 or even 7. And with no outdoor access, and where the cats essentially had to have some kind of a timeshare schedule, almost, where they were being moved around the home because a lot of the cats couldn't interact with each other because there was inter-cat aggression. And I think one of the ways that we tried to look at it a little bit is from a welfare assessment lens. So obviously, in the field of veterinary behavior medicine, we kind of cross over a little bit with welfare. And, even the European colleges of animal welfare and behavior medicine are kind of together. So behavior medicine, welfare are always kind of touching each other and go very much hand in hand. And one of the ways that we can actually assess welfare for some of these cats is using the 5 freedoms model, which is a model that was designed in the 1960s, essentially originally for farm animals, to try and understand whether behavioral needs and welfare needs were being met, and has since been superseded by some other models. The 5 domains model might be nowadays more valuable to look at. But I think just even going back to that very basic, are we meeting the 5 freedoms that this cat should have, I think can be really helpful. And we actually sort of did this exercise when we were there. And so if I just chat you through the 5 freedoms. So the first freedom is freedom from hunger and thirst, which in many of these cases is being met. That's one of the things that's actually usually very well provided for. We know we've got good quality food, we've got access to food. And then if there's a little bit of education around it, we also can make sure that the cats are fed in a way that cats would like to be fed. So that freedom from hunger and thirst is never usually an issue. Nor is, and this is where perhaps another conversation needs to come in, nor is the freedom from pain, disease, and illness. So that's also something that is usually relatively well met when, especially when we take cats off the street that perhaps have a disease or are injured, and we're able to take care of them and provide ongoing care. So those 2 freedoms, I think, are usually well met when we do take maybe a street cat into our home. However, we have 3 other freedoms that we need to think about that I think are not always perfectly met. So the third freedom would be the freedom from, let's say, environmental discomfort. So the freedom to have an optimal environment. And as we've just touched upon, that can sometimes be a struggle, especially if you think about a cat that no longer has access to the outdoors, or a cat that now lives in an environment with other unfamiliar cats. There might be tension, in the home. We might not have enough resources. We might have other social stressors in that home. So I think that whole environmental freedom can be compromised. Then the fourth freedom is the freedom from fear, anxiety, distress, other negative emotional states. And I think that's something that we compromise. I think we see a lot of these cats as being frustrated because they can't access the resources, especially the outdoors, the control of their territory, all those sorts of things that's really important to them. So we get a negative emotional state, which we don't want. And then the final freedom is the fifth one, is the freedom to perform natural species specific behaviors. And that's also, I think, a freedom that we often compromise by taking some of these previously outdoor cats into our home, depending on the home, obviously. But if you think about that cat that was previously able to go where they wanted, sleep, rest, move, hunt, all those things according to their needs and their species specific behavioral needs, they're often not able to do that when we kind of take them out of that environment into a home. And I'm not saying that all pet cats have these welfare needs met perfectly. No, it's always an ongoing conversation around that. But I do feel that potentially compromising 3 of the 5 freedoms for some of these cats is a concern. And I think, that's where, when we look at the bigger picture, I think that's where we kind of need to be looking to see whether they actually have a life worth living, which is that phrase that comes in when you think about the 5 domains. Do they actually have a life worth living? Are they able to find positive emotions and joy in that life? And I think that's really where sort of the touch points come in when we're looking at some of these cases for me.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, a lot of the cats that do deal with stress, fear, and anxiety, it's on a chronic level too. For sure, there's stress when they're living their natural life out on the street, when they have encounters, or any multiple things that could happen during a given day. But those are, I guess, kind of healthy or normal stresses, where sometimes living in this confined arrangement, and especially if they're in a rehoming situation too, where maybe they're actually kennelled for extended period of time, that's a real chronic stress that they're under.
Yeah, and that chronic stress can then lead to physical illness. So we know that urinary tract disease, upper airway disease they're the 2 poster childs in cats for physical manifestations of chronic stress situations. And we absolutely do see that, especially some of the cats from the street that may have been exposed to something like a herpes virus in their past, in their early life on the street, and then they find themselves in a chronic stress situation, and then they have chronic upper respiratory airway disease, upper respiratory tract disease. And it just is something that can then spill over to the physical. And as we know, mental, emotional, physical are always connected. We can't separate the 2, mental and emotional, from physical, and vice versa. So that's always something that absolutely needs to be considered.
I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit on the idea of taming. So it's something that I see posted a lot about, especially in relation to kittens maybe taken off the street, or older kittens, and they are seen, the kind of summary of examples of use is that they're hissing, they're spitting, they absolutely are terrified of that human contact, but that the caregiver will try and give them more and more positive things and more human contact, to the point where they then consider them tame and suitable for rehoming. So I'd like to know, I guess, from the scientific point of view, how you feel about that, because I think that's something that I definitely encounter in practice.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. So taming as a definition, it can actually be applied both to domestic species as well as wild species, right? So you can also talk about taming a wild species. And all that really means is reducing their flight distance, essentially, is having them to be more comfortable around human presence, with human contact. So that's kind of the scientific definition of taming. I wonder whether what you're describing there is actually more flooding, which is essentially forcibly exposing an animal to something that they're very fearful of until the moment where they just stop behaving. So flooding is essentially a learning theory concept, right? It's a very old-fashioned training mechanism or training protocol. You can kind of relate this to, and Nora, I'm going to give this example because I know how much you love spiders, but it's essentially the equivalent of exposing a person that is really fearful of spiders, like Nora, and kind of popping her into a spider pit until she just kind of gets over herself and gives up on being scared of spiders. Now, tell me as a spider lover, how does that thought feel to you?
I mean, I think I would be emotionally dead at some point, there's just, it's like literally my worst fear. But yeah, no, I think the word flooding is absolutely what this often is. But I think it's, again, a little bit confusing because it's done with best intentions. And I think, yeah, it's really important for people to understand the science behind it, like you're explaining.
Yeah, and I think, familiarization to the presence of people, either with positive reinforcement or potentially even negative reinforcement, those might be things that can be considered, so pairing the presence of a human being with good things happening. However, the really important piece here is that we have to read that animal's body language. And if they're displaying signs of distress, fear, anxiety, discomfort in the presence of that person, that's too much. Then we either have to increase the distance, that occurs in. So they're literally maybe just even seeing a person and getting some kind of a reward for that. And that can be done in a variety of ways, or we decrease the amounts of time that it's literally 10 seconds. Here's the person, here's a yummy treat. And then that person leaves again, which leaves us with a kind of a double reinforcement of getting the treat and then the relief of the person leaving again. So that, I think there are ways of doing it, but it has to be done so knowledgeably, so sympathetically, so slowly, because otherwise what you end up with is absolutely flooding. And the problem with flooding is that it can lead to a state of learned helplessness, where essentially the animal just gives up. They learn that no matter what they do, their response isn't heard or their voice isn't heard. So they just crawl into their little shell and they become behaviorally shut down. And that is equally an extremely negative welfare state for them to be living in.
Yeah, I agree. I think the other one that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on too, for people potentially adopting, is kittens of a feral or a street mom. I recently had a case where there was two mothers and they were pretty feral. They absolutely wanted no human contact whatsoever. And they had both had litters of kittens, but they had been very isolated from humans during this time. They had been kept in a room and fed and given litters and everything, but very, very little actual interaction. And now the kittens are about, let's say, 4 months old, and they're absolutely beautiful. But very, very scared. Of the about 8 kittens that I saw, there was one who was approaching me and the rest were just hiding. So I think that's a whole, another step on for it too, is assessing kittens. And I just wondered what your thoughts are for people maybe adopting a street cat or kitten, that, what they should look for, or how important the mother's role is in those early weeks, and also just in their genetics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think, the place we probably need to start is the socialization period. I mean, we probably need to start even earlier than that. But I think the socialization period is such a crucial period for these kittens that are going to be learning about the world around them, what social interactions mean, whether they're good, whether they're bad. And that period in kittens is between 2 and 7, maybe up to 9 weeks of age. So oftentimes it's very much before, these kittens are maybe then taken off the street. Or you just mentioned, the kittens that you saw, they were probably about 4 months old. They are way past their socialization period by then. So all of their learning around social relationships would have happened much, much earlier. Now, kittens also learn from their mums. We're not sure to what degree we have observational learning, but certainly we know that, kittens that learn to hunt from their mothers potentially are going to find it easier to hunt in the future. So there will be some degree of observational learning going on. It's actually interesting. I listened to a webinar when I was studying for my exams by one of the other diplomats from the American College. And what we do know is that if the mother cat has very positive social interactions with people, then the kittens might be more likely to also learn that people are good things and might be more positive towards people. What we don't know, and what we don't have any kind of evidence or research for, is how that is in the reverse. So if the mum is very scared of humans, to what degree that influences the kittens. But I presume that there has to be probably some kind of observational learning going on there. And then if we go back even before the socialization period, that whole kind of epigenetics that we spoke about earlier, then I think for sure kittens born to a stressed mother are going to have a different stress system themselves. They're going to be primed differently for how to cope with stressors. They might have a dysregulated stress response system. So they're going to be much more likely to have a propensity towards fear, anxiety, and stress than to being bold and confident. And then there's something else, and that is that the temperament of the father, which we often don't know, plays an important role in the development of the temperament of the kittens. So if you have a friendly, outgoing, bold father, you're more likely to get friendly, bold, outgoing kittens. And if you have a fearful father, then that might be the reverse. Obviously, they'll be more fearful. So there's a lot that goes into that, I guess, is what I want to say is, you know, there are so many factors that go into shaping an individual kitten's stress response, their temperament, you know, then how they're going to develop their personality going forwards. And what's really interesting to me is that you said out of those 8 kittens, there was one that would approach and the others were scared. So you can see that there might be an exception to that kind of overall package, but it will be the 1 out of 8, right? It'll be the very, very much smaller number, whereas 7 out of 8 kittens will be much more likely to be fearful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one other thing before we wrap up that I really wanted to talk about, because this is a question that we get asked quite a lot, is about that kind of weighing up game between should you let your cats out and risk them getting hurt, injured, hit by a car, contracting FIV, all those dangers that we can potentially encounter when we let our cats go out. So that's the one side of the coin. I don't want to let my cat out because I'm scared they're going to get hurt, injured, diseased, which is understandable. And then the other side of the equation, which is, but what does that mean for their behavioral health? So we might be protecting their physical health, but we might inadvertently or at the same time be damaging their mental and emotional health. And I know we chat through this with people quite a lot, because I think a lot of cat owners or recent cat adopters do have that concern, that they're worried that if they let them out, something bad is going to happen. What are your thoughts on that? What would your response be to a client that asked you about that?
I think if you can let them out and you're happy with the safety precautions, that you should let them out. I think there's so much in the outside world that we absolutely cannot replicate inside our homes. We can really, really try, and we can do a pretty good job with giving cats a lot of what they need. But to have, you know, the sun on them and to have the ability to hunt and all of those things, I think can't be matched, and that any cat enjoys it. There's a bit of a division in my own home about this, because my husband gets very stressed if the cats are out or missing or gone for too long, to the point where he will, you know, leave the property and have a flashlight and look as long as he has to find the cats. Whereas for me, I actually feel no stress at all when they go, because I feel fully confident in them. I trust them. It's almost like they're my adult children. I trust them to make their own choices. I really do. And I also, you know, believe very much that cats, they care more about their quality of life than their quantity of life. And should anything happen to them living free, you know, then that's the life that they decided to go. That's where they decided to go. I think every precaution should be made to keep cats safe, and everything you can do to, you know, keep other cats out of your property. You know, making sure your cat is always up to date with vaccines. For sure, there's absolutely risks. One of the most common things we see in clinic is cat bite abscesses, because cats do fight. That is absolutely a risk. There are plenty, but for me personally, I would always take those risks over the risk of my cats having chronic stress or long-term behavioral issues from them being denied that option.
Yeah, it's so funny because it's exactly the same in our household as well. My husband does the same. He will also make sure that everybody's in the evening before, everybody goes to bed. All the cats have to be in, definitely. Yeah, and I agree. I mean, look, there are risks with everything, I think, and it's a question of weighing them up, understanding, yes, what you're comfortable with. I think that's important. But I think looking at the cat's quality of life is really key here. And I agree with you. I think it's, there is a lot that the outside world can offer in terms of enrichment that's really difficult to replicate indoors. I think essentially it comes down to everybody's own decision, but it needs to be an informed decision. I think people need to know that if they decide to keep their cats in, what potential risks come with that as well, because that also carries a risk, keeping them in and not letting them have access to the outdoors. I think especially if there are multiple cats in the home, and then there is absolutely that restriction on space and that inability to get away from each other and disperse from each other, which is so important. So yeah, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer as well. I think it's a case of educating about the risks, both the physical and the mental and emotional, and then coming up with a plan that is going to suit everybody, and especially the cats in that case, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, what you said about providing inside the house options too is really, really important. If your cat isn't going to have outside access, it's really important anyways to have all the resources your cat should need in the home. But definitely, I mean, for here during summer, when the cats might just not choose to go out as much, if, maybe they're getting older, maybe they're just not as mobile, or they're not as interested in going out, we still need to provide in the house all of their resources and lots of different options for them to act out these natural instincts as much as possible. And I think if you are a cat owner of an ex-street cat, if you already own an Arabian Mau or thinking of getting one, that you just have to pay special attention to making sure that you really provide for them, all the 5 pillars to their maximum, really.
Yeah. So that was actually going to be my final question to you. What would you advise someone who was perhaps considering adopting a street cat? I think you've made some excellent points. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I think it would always be worth seeking, the opinion of somebody specially trained. So, obviously veterinary behaviorist. If you have a cat-friendly clinic, there's a cat advocate at that clinic, which is just somebody who pays special attention to cats, I guess. And they might be able to help you a little bit more with assessing the cat in question, and also with giving them all of their needs at home. So following the 5 pillars, providing them all of those things in the home at all times is important. But I think reaching out to people who maybe know a lot on this issue or can, read body language. I think there's a lot of stuff online. There's a lot of groups. There's a lot of people with conflicting opinions. I think definitely seeking out the advice of a veterinary behaviorist or a group like iCat Care or something is really, really good to make sure you're giving them everything they need.
Yeah, so I'm also going to give a shout out here to iCat Care. They actually have an unowned cat group who very much kind of do research on and consider the questions around unowned cats, essentially street cats, and whether they should be brought into our homes, and the whole idea of the in-betweeners that Nora mentioned earlier on in the conversation. And I'm also going to put, Nora's referred a couple of times to the 5 pillars. So that's our ISFN feline environmental guidelines. They're essentially the 5 pillars of a healthy feline environment. So the 5 big pillars of what we need to provide to cats for them to have a healthy environment. I'll pop that in the show notes. That's free to download. It's open access, so anybody can read that. And that actually gives really good information about, what the primary needs of cats are. But certainly, absolutely, go on over to iCat Care. They're a fantastic non-profit organization that really deal with all sort of the issues surrounding cats, cat health, cat well-being, all that kind of thing. So that's a great resource to go to. Any final words before we sign off?
I love Arabian Maus. I absolutely love Arabian Maus, and I think they're a very, very special breed. I think, each individual Arabian Mau will have very different needs, and it's just important to try to ask them what their needs are.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. They're a very, very unique breed of cat. And obviously, if you're listening from outside the UAE, I'm sure you have experiences with the cat breeds in your local area. And, I know that this is a kind of a topic worldwide. This is a global thing. It's not just something from the UAE. So yeah, that's everything for this episode, I guess. So wherever in the world that you've listened from and whatever cat breeds you have there, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode and that it's given you some food for thought. And I very much look forward to seeing you next week for episode 55. Bye for now.